They said the Duke's horse would break any man who tried to ride it, but no one expected it to bow its head to a woman who didn't even try. For 3 years, the great black stallion had refused every rider who approached it, as if it carried within it some quiet judgment no human could pass. And the estate had long since turned the creature into a legend whispered between servants and laughed off by noble guests who never dared step too close. Some claimed the horse had been cursed after its former master died under mysterious circumstances. Others believed it simply possessed a will too strong to be bent. The Duke himself never confirmed or denied any story. He only ensured the animal was fed, sheltered, and left entirely alone. Much like certain parts of his own life no one was permitted to touch. And so the years passed with an unspoken understanding. The horse belonged to no one, and no one belonged to it. Until the morning she arrived. There was nothing remarkable about her at first glance. No grand entrance, no whispered announcement, no indication that she would disrupt anything in a place so firmly rooted in routine. She came as many did, quietly employed, expected to blend into the background of a household that valued order above all else. The estate was vast, disciplined, and carefully managed, and she understood immediately that her role within it would be small, nearly invisible. But invisibility, she had learned, was not the same as insignificance. She noticed things others ignored, the way certain corridors remained colder than the rest, the subtle tension among staff when the Duke's name was mentioned, and most curiously, the way conversations seemed to stop whenever the distant sound of hooves echoed from the far end of the property. It took her only 2 days to learn about the horse, though no one told her directly. Instead, it lived in the gaps of conversation, in the warnings disguised as casual remarks, in the way the stable hands avoided one particular direction as if it were not part of their responsibility. "Don't go near the far stable," one of them muttered when she asked where the grooming tools were kept, his tone too quick, too rehearsed. "There's nothing there for you." But that, of course, only ensured she would go, not out of defiance, but curiosity, quiet, persistent, and impossible to ignore. On the 3rd morning, while the rest of the estate settled into its usual rhythm, she found herself walking toward that very place, guided by instinct more than intention. The air felt different there, heavier somehow, as though even the wind hesitated to pass through. When she reached the stable, she paused at the entrance, not out of fear but respect, as one might before stepping into a space that belonged entirely to something else. Inside, the stallion stood alone. It was larger than she expected, its dark coat catching the faint light that filtered through the wooden slats, its presence filling the space in a way that made the rest of the world seem distant. It did not move when she entered. It did not react as a startled animal might. Instead, it watched her, still, measured, aware. There was no hostility in its gaze, but neither was there welcome. It was, she realized, the look of something that had already decided what most people were worth and found them lacking. She remained where she was, saying nothing at first, allowing the silence to settle between them. The stories had painted this creature as dangerous, unpredictable, impossible. But standing there, she saw something else entirely, something quieter, something deeper. Not anger, not madness, but distance. A kind of distance that came not from wildness, but from disappointment. Slowly, she stepped closer, her movements deliberate, unthreatening. Somewhere behind her, she heard a shout, one of the stable hands, his voice sharp with panic, but she did not turn. The horse shifted slightly, its ears flicking forward, its attention narrowing entirely on her. She could feel the weight of that focus, but she did not retreat. Instead, she spoke. The words themselves were simple, almost ordinary, but her voice carried something that had nothing to do with command or control. It held no expectation, no demand, only recognition. "You don't have to pretend with me," she said softly, as though continuing a conversation that had begun long before she arrived. The horse did not react immediately. For a moment, nothing changed. And then, almost imperceptibly, its posture eased. The tension that had defined it for years seemed to loosen, not entirely, but enough to matter. Encouraged, she took another step forward, close enough now to see the subtle scars along its flank, the faint marks left by those who had tried and failed to claim it. Her expression shifted, not with fear, but understanding. They didn't listen, she murmured. They only wanted you to obey. This time, the horse moved. Not away from her, but toward her. It lowered its head slightly, a gesture so small it might have gone unnoticed by anyone expecting something dramatic. But to her, it was everything. She lifted her hand, pausing just short of touching it, giving the animal the choice to close the distance. It did. The contact was brief, almost cautious, but it was enough to send a ripple of astonishment through the few witnesses who had gathered at the stable entrance, too afraid to intervene, too shocked to look away. No one spoke. No one dared. Because in that moment, something impossible had just occurred. Not through force, not through skill, but through something far less understood. Trust. And though none of them could fully grasp it yet, that single moment would begin to unravel everything the estate believed it knew, about the horse, about the Duke, and about the quiet woman who had somehow done what no one else could, simply by choosing to see what others refused to. By the time the sun had climbed high enough to burn away the morning mist, the entire estate had already begun reshaping the story to make sense of it, because people rarely accept something extraordinary without trying to make it ordinary first. Some insisted the horse must have been tired. Others claimed she had some hidden skill or trick she had not revealed, and a few dismissed it altogether as coincidence. But none of them could explain why, when she returned to the stable that afternoon, the stallion lifted its head the moment she stepped inside, as though it had been waiting. It did not behave that way for anyone else. The grooms still kept their distance, performing their duties quickly and with unease, careful never to linger too long near the animal that had embarrassed stronger men than them. But she moved without hesitation, her presence calm, unhurried, as though she understood that whatever connection had formed that morning could not be rushed or forced into something it was not ready to become. She spoke to the horse again, not constantly, not in a way meant to soothe or distract, but in quiet intervals, as if offering pieces of herself rather than trying to take anything from it. And each time she did, the stallion responded, not with obedience, but with attention. It watched her in a way that felt almost deliberate, as though it were learning her just as carefully as she was learning it. It was during one of these quiet afternoons that the Duke finally came to see for himself. He did not announce his presence when he entered the stable. He rarely did. Authority, in his experience, did not need to declare itself loudly. It existed in the way people reacted when it appeared. The grooms straightened immediately, stepping back as if the space itself belonged to him more than them, but his attention passed over them without pause. It settled instead on the stallion, and then, slowly, on her. For a moment, he said nothing. He simply observed. The horse stood closer to her than it had ever allowed anyone, its posture relaxed but alert, as if aware that something significant was unfolding. She did not turn to greet him right away. Whether she had sensed him or simply chosen not to break the moment was unclear, but when she finally did face him, there was no nervousness in her expression, no attempt to justify what she was doing. If anything, she seemed mildly curious. "I was told you'd been coming here," he said, his voice even, controlled. "I was told not to," she replied. There was no challenge in her tone, just a quiet statement of fact. "And yet you came anyway." "Yes." The simplicity of it unsettled him more than defiance would have. He was used to resistance he could measure, arguments he could dismantle, but not this kind of calm certainty that refused to position itself against him at all. His gaze shifted briefly to the horse. "It hasn't allowed anyone near it in 3 years," he said. "Not without consequence." "It allows me," she answered. "That much is obvious." Another pause followed, but it did not feel empty. It felt like something being considered from multiple directions at once. Finally, he stepped closer, though not too close. He knew better than that. "Why?" he asked. She glanced at the horse before answering, as if the question concerned it more than her. "Because I didn't come to take anything from it." He studied her more carefully then, searching for something beneath the words. Ambition, perhaps, or calculation, but found neither. "Everyone who approaches it wants the same thing," he said. "To ride it. To prove they can. And that's why they fail." The certainty in her voice was not arrogance. It was observation. "Then what do you want?" he asked. This time, she hesitated, not because she lacked an answer, but because she seemed to consider whether he would understand it. "Nothing," she said at last. "That's why it trusts me." The statement lingered in the space between them, unsettling in its implication. Because if what she said was true, then the fault had never been in the horse at all. It had been in the people who approached it. Before he could respond, she did something that shifted the entire moment. Slowly, without any announcement, she reached for the horse's mane and placed her foot against the low fence. The grooms tensed immediately, one of them taking an involuntary step forward, but the Duke lifted a hand, just slightly, and the man froze. They all watched as she moved with quiet confidence, not forcing, not demanding, simply trusting the stillness that had formed between her and the animal. And then, with a fluid motion that felt almost inevitable, she was seated on its back. The stallion did not resist. It did not flinch, rear, or attempt to throw her. It simply stood there, steady beneath her, as though this had always been the outcome waiting to happen. Something in the Duke's expression changed then. Not dramatically, not in a way anyone else might have noticed, but enough to matter. Because what he was witnessing was not skill alone. It was something far more dangerous. It was connection. And connection, unlike force, could not be commanded or replicated. "Walk," he said, almost without thinking. She looked down at him, a faint crease forming between her brows. "Why?" The question caught him off guard. No one ever asked him why. "To see if you can," he replied. "I already know I can," she said. "The question is whether it wants to." And just like that, she turned the choice away from herself and placed it where it belonged. For a brief moment, nothing happened. Then the horse moved, not because it had been told to, but because it had decided. It took a single step forward, then another, carrying her with a quiet, effortless grace that made the years of failure before it seem almost irrelevant. The stable fell completely silent, every eye fixed on the sight, as if afraid it might vanish if they looked away. She guided it gently, not directing so much as accompanying, her movements subtle, responsive rather than controlling. When she finally brought it to a stop, she slid down just as easily as she had mounted, her hand lingering briefly against its neck. Only then did she look back at the Duke. "It doesn't belong to me," she said, "and it never will." He held her gaze, something unspoken passing through the space between them. "No," he said quietly, "it doesn't." But as he watched the horse shift closer to her, as though reluctant to let the moment end, he realized something he had not expected to learn. It might not belong to her, but it had chosen her, and for reasons he could not yet explain. That mattered more. She chose to leave before anything could be said out loud, because some truths, once spoken, demand answers she was not certain either of them was ready to give. The decision came quietly, without drama, formed in the still hours before dawn when the estate felt less like a place to belong and more like a place she had merely passed through. She understood the distance between them, not just in title, but in expectation, in the unspoken rules that shaped his world and would eventually close in around hers if she stayed. And though the horse had chosen her, the Duke had not fully, not in the way that required risk. So she packed what little she had brought, left word with no one who could stop her, and walked away along the narrow road that curved beyond the hills, the early light soft against the horizon, as if the day itself were reluctant to begin. The Duke learned of her absence not through announcement, but through disruption. The rhythm of the estate had shifted in a way that was almost imperceptible to anyone else, but not to him. Something was missing, and once he recognized it, the realization came with a clarity that left no room for denial. He went first to the stables, already knowing what he would find. The stallion was restless, not violent, not unruly, but unsettled, its movements sharp with a quiet agitation that had not been there before. It turned toward the entrance when he arrived, as though expecting someone else, and for a moment, he stood there with the uncomfortable awareness that he was not the one it had hoped to see. "She's gone," he said aloud, though there was no one to hear it but the animal. The horse shifted, stamping once against the ground. And in that moment, something in him finally gave way. Not pride, not authority, but the careful restraint he had mistaken for control. He stepped forward and opened the gate, the sound of the latch louder than it should have been in the stillness. "You don't belong here without her," he said quietly. Then, after a pause that carried more meaning than the words themselves, he added, "Neither do I." He stepped back. For 3 years, he had kept the horse contained, respecting its refusal while never truly understanding it. Now, for the first time, he did something different. He let it choose. Go. The stallion did not hesitate. It surged forward, past him, through the open space, and into the morning light with a speed that felt less like escape and more like certainty. He watched it disappear down the road, a dark shape against the rising day, and for a brief moment, he remained where he was, as though giving himself one last chance to remain the man he had always been, the one who let things go rather than risk reaching for them. Then he followed, not as a duke issuing commands, but as a man who had finally understood the cost of silence. Miles away, she heard the sound before she saw it, the steady rhythm of hooves cutting through the quiet, growing louder with each passing second until it was impossible to ignore. She turned, her breath catching slightly as the stallion came into view, its pace slowing only when it reached her. It stopped just a few steps away, its head lowering in that same deliberate gesture it had offered her before, as if asking a question it already knew the answer to. "You shouldn't be here," she said softly, though there was no conviction in it. The horse remained. Of course it did. It had already decided. She reached out, her hand brushing against its neck, and for a moment, the world seemed to narrow to that single point of contact. Familiar, steady, real. She could have turned back then, could have led it home, returned everything to the way it had been, safe and unchanged. But she didn't move, because she sensed it before she saw him. Footsteps behind her, slower than the horse, but no less certain. She turned again. The Duke stood there, closer than she expected, his composure altered in a way that would have gone unnoticed by anyone who did not know him. But she did. The distance he once carried so effortlessly was gone, replaced by something far more vulnerable and infinitely more honest. "You let it go," she said. "I stopped trying to keep what was never mine," he replied, his voice quieter than she had ever heard it. The words settled between them, carrying more than just their surface meaning. "And now?" she asked. He took a step closer, not enough to close the space entirely, but enough to show he intended to. "Now I understand that some things aren't meant to be held in place," he said. "They're meant to be met where they are and asked to stay." There was no command in his voice, no expectation, only truth. She studied him for a long moment, searching for the hesitation that had once defined him, the restraint that had kept him silent when it mattered most. But it wasn't there, not anymore. The horse shifted beside her, calm, patient, as though it had been waiting for this moment all along. She exhaled slowly, the weight of her decision no lighter than before, but clearer. "You didn't ask me to stay," she said. "No," he admitted. "I didn't. And now?" This time, he didn't hesitate. "Now I am." The simplicity of it left no room for misinterpretation, no room for retreat. For a moment, nothing moved. Not the wind, not the road stretching endlessly behind them, not even the space between them that had once felt so impossible to cross. Then, quietly, she stepped forward. Not all the way, but enough. Her hand, still resting against the horse, shifted, just slightly, until it found his. And this time, when their fingers met, neither of them pulled away. The stallion let out a slow breath, its tension easing as if some invisible balance had finally been restored. When they turned back toward the estate, they did not lead it. They did not command it. They simply walked, and the horse followed, not out of obedience, but because, at last, it no longer needed to refuse anyone to be understood.